Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many people here. Hold tight. We're going to try and sort that. So it's fantastic to see so many students, so many staff members here. So you're all very, very welcome to today's Couch Chat event brought to you by a Healthy MTU. My name is Andrea Bickerdike. I'm a lecturer in health and wellbeing, and along with Cian, I'm the co-lead of a Healthy MTU, and strongly supported by our whole university team, all of whom are here today as well. Um, for those of you who may not have heard of what a Healthy MTU is, it's a health promotion movement. It aims to create a supportive, healthy environment here. It's aligned with a national movement where universities are really now stepping up to try to create places and spaces that support people to be healthy and well. Today's event is part of, you might have heard of the broader Healthy MTU Roadshow. So there's been a series of initiatives and events throughout the week. So it's been fantastic. And thank you to everybody who has supported us. I'd just like to acknowledge in particular as well our student volunteers who were here early this morning helping us to get set up. So we would love, as a Healthy MTU grows, for more of you to become involved in that as well. Um, just thinking in terms of today's event, it's wonderful to have the opportunity to create time and space to have important conversations, impactful conversations, and that's really what the next hour or so will be about. We have three fantastic guests who have joined us today, each with a unique story to tell. So whether we're students, staff members, colleagues, over the next hour, it's about coming together as a community and hearing people's stories, and there'll certainly be things we can all take away from that today. Just some very brief housekeeping in terms of health and safety. There's no fire drills planned for today. In the unlikely event we hear the alarm, we'll make our way to the nearest exit. I feel a bit like an air hostess at the top of the room here. So I'm going to introduce our MC, so co-lead of a Healthy MTU, Dr. Cian O'Neill. He is the head of Department of Sport, Leisure and Childhood Studies. He'll be well known, particularly in an elite sports performance domain, and in addition has vast expertise in health and well-being. And just to acknowledge his efforts in terms of continuously advocating approaches that support student and staff health and well-being, developing a health research group here in the university, developing a series of programs in health and well-being as well. Cian is also internationally published in the area of designing trauma-informed educational settings, which I think will tie in a lot with today's conversation. So it's my pleasure to call on Dr. Cian O'Neill, who will be your MC for the event today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Friends, colleagues, guests to the university today, you're all incredibly welcome to this novel event, we would say. Novel in many ways, first of all, because we have a phenomenal panel lined up here today that bring a vast array of expertise, experience, but perhaps most importantly of all, because it is a couch talk event, a lived experience in terms of the storytelling and story sharing we're going to impart to you all today. Can I also just say it is refreshing to see so many students and staff and guests in the room today. We initially started with a plan for 80. Yesterday, we connected with our caretaker friends to say, can we increase that to 150? Because the interest was really, really positive. And now, thanks to David back there shaking his head with pure disgust as more chairs are being put out here, guys. We're going to hit the 200 mark. So just to say thank you very, very much. It's a huge endorsement for the work of the Healthy Campus Initiative and for the whole area of health and well-being on campus that we have such interest in. But just to get down to business, it's certainly not about the Healthy Campus Initiative per se for the next 45, 50 minutes or so, but more about learning about lived experiences. And we have three phenomenal guests, as I said, with us here. Our first guest is known to a huge audience in Cork and indeed all across the island from the Two Norries podcast, which he co-hosts with his colleague James Leonard. Over the time of this podcast, and indeed with all the different engagements that he's been involved in. He's spoken about his life of crime, alcohol, drug addiction, gambling addiction, which led to periods of detention, incarceration, and also led to a life changing moment where, at the age of 32 years of age, while in prison, he learned to read for the first time. He's taken all of these experiences into positive development in his life, returned to college, ironically here in CIT, and completed his degree in recent years in construction management, and now runs his own property maintenance company and employs many people who are in recovery. Ladies and gentlemen, can I introduce you to Timmy Long? Our second speaker today is a postdoctoral researcher in public health, so we might be recruiting her to join our Healthy Campus initiative going forward. A writer on Substack, founder of Sober Curious Ireland, which has led me to be very, very sober curious as I was conducting my research into today's event. And part of the reason that she's here today is that she quit drinking in 2020. And there's a bigger story behind that and an even bigger story since that moment in time. So, here to tell us all about her journey and her relationship with alcohol is Dr. Melissa Kelly. Our third guest and friend of MTU, because Oisín has been involved in several different initiatives we've had over the last number of years, is a former All Ireland winner in 2002, seven-time Ulster Championship winner with Armagh, and multiple All Ireland Club Championship winner with his club Crossmaglen Rangers. Currently manager of the Wicklow senior football team and a very, very, very passionate supporter of Armagh GAA. So, for the one and only time that I will mention today that Armagh are the current All Ireland champions, Oisín is going to share with us his relationship with gambling, his relationship with addiction, the work that he has done over the last number of years as an advocate for speaking out about the importance of becoming aware of the dangers, the prevalence, I guess, and the dangers of addiction, but also working with young people, not just through his work in Dundalk IT, where he was involved in the sports program there for years, but in initiatives and events like this all over the country. He also currently is an ambassador to Gambling Awareness Trust, and many of you might have seen the advertisement on TV that runs every evening with other Irish sports stars that is trying to increase awareness in this space. Oisín Mc Conville, everybody. Timmy, we might just get straight into it. The Two Norries podcast, it pretty much is what launched you into almost the national headlines in terms of the connection that you created with the Irish nation. It was a curious time, an interesting time during COVID. Do you want to just give us a little bit of a background as to what instigated the podcast, how it all came to be?
Um, yeah, sure. It was just there's a lot of people out there really struggling with different addictions, and it was around the same time James had been on was it the Tommy Tiernan show, and he'd been bombarded really by questions from people in relation just about addiction, and there was no way that he could answer them. And we had a conversation one day while we were having out, we were walking, and I just said, let's start the podcast. And the first four podcasts were based on my life, the first two, and his life, the next two. But for me, it was a really challenging experience because it wasn't something, I wasn't a very public figure. You know, I was very private. I wasn't on social media, but there was something inside me just really pushing me to do something like this, even though I was completely full of fear. And I think that it was crippling, you know. And for the 2 weeks that my podcast it came out on YouTube and the other platform, I had to really kind of mind myself. You know, I was just very emotional, and because I believed in my own head that I wasn't. I wasn't able for this, and there was going to be a lot of kickback because of my past, because of criminality and the drugs and everything else. And it wasn't. It was the opposite. There was a lot of people didn't really know the different things that would have happened to me as a young person, and they were able to understand why I was probably behaving in the different ways I was as an adult and a young person in my teens and stuff. And a lot of people were welcoming about it. They came up to me and they just kind of just embraced me really with open arms and said, "Listen to me, we didn't know all these things were going on for you." And from that experience, then it gave me more of a push then to continue doing what we were doing, because what we were doing was opening people's eyes up to other people who were living in poverty, addiction, violence, social economic areas where there was just a lot of different things happening. And but then again, there was no justification for people's actions, for criminality, for drugs, for people getting hurt and stuff. But what we were trying to do was just give people another picture, and that picture was painted by the Two Norries. We continue to do. We done nearly 200 podcasts. Myself and James. We travelled all over the country. We went to Portugal doing conferences for the Irish Prison Service. We became employees of the Irish Prison Service, of the Justice Department. Our lives completely changed. I went from somebody who couldn't get a job over my criminal record one year to the next year, just consistently being employed for different things, and it completely changed my life. Because what happened really was I didn't have to hide myself anymore. I remember finishing my fourth year here, and there was a lot of talk about interviews and all these things from the lecturers and stuff. And the lecturers here were fantastic. I couldn't praise them enough. But this kind of stuff really, really put me down, because I was you have the guard of vetting and all these different processes that go on for somebody who wants to get employed. And it kind of really disheartened me. And I had a few interviews and they didn't work out. And then I started my own business. But the two Norries helped me to grow as a human being as well. And I'm very grateful for what it has given me. But in recent times, in the last year, we started another podcast based on people who are struggling with ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. And we have people on just to explain the differences between things for children now and adults. And we have a psychotherapist on board, and we have Tommy, my brother, who's another, he's in recovery as well. And that podcast is called The Long Way Back. And that has been my work for the last year, and it has absolutely helped me to grow again as an individual even more, because I took more of a lead role in it, and my life is completely 360. Like, if you asked me to do something like this 5 years ago and sit in the stage, I'd be probably hiding behind me if it was just, my life has completely changed. And still, as all this is going on, continuously minding myself as well in my own recovery.
Wow, and that's powerful. Just as a matter of interest, hands up, everyone here who has heard to at least one episode of the Two Norries, just in terms of impact. Okay, and now there's another one on the road. Is it the long road back?
A long way back.
The long way back. Okay, so make sure you tap into that as well, guys. And it's a nice segue. Something that really resonated with me there, Timmy, was that you felt that you were accelerating your recovery by helping other people on their journey to their recovery. And I think there's something altruistic about that. That it was for you, but it was also for the greater good of others.
Yeah. And people are still watching the Two Norries podcast. Like, they probably will forever, because these topics that we spoke about are things that are happening on a daily basis with people, and it will continue to keep growing. And there's other podcasts out there now that are just similar. It just happened to be that myself and James were probably maybe the first ones doing what we were doing, which was crazy, and something to be proud of, for both of us. But it also had its challenges as well.
Sure.
Had its stresses around family and everything else. But it's it's something I'm very, very proud of.
Brilliant, amazing. And we will come back to those
Thank you.
challenges because I think that's part of the reason we are here today. Did any of that strike a chord, Melissa, from your own perspective? Before you answer that, rumor has it you have a border collie called Nimbus.
I do.
And I'm not sure if you're aware, but we have a research center in MTU called the Nimbus
Aware.
Research Center. So that's quite interesting. I think we'll find that your accent is not quite a north side accent from Cork. So do you want to give us a little bit of an intro to your own background?
Yep. So my accent is probably all over the place. That's because I've lived all over the place. So I was born in the US, in Philadelphia, to Irish parents. There's a huge Irish community over there on the east coast of the US. Lived there till I was 8 years old. When I was 8 years old, we moved up to Derry in Northern Ireland, which is where my father's from. Lived there for 6 years. Went back to the same exact place in Philadelphia where we lived before. So we went back over, took the dog and everything both times, which was very stressful. And then that's where I did my high school and I had my undergraduate degree. That's where I started drinking. And I'd say from the moment I started drinking, I knew it affected me differently, we'll just say. From moving back and forth so many times, I had this narrative in my head that I'm different, I don't belong. I was always the weird Irish girl in America or the weird American girl in Ireland. And when I was drinking, a lot of that noise went away, and I felt like I could fit in, and I felt like I belonged, and I felt like I could talk to boys, and I was confident, and I had more fun with my friends. And so in the beginning, it was an amazing experience drinking, to be honest. Like it was fun, and went through college, binge drinking on the weekends, the usual partying. And it wasn't until I finished my undergrad degree, I studied psychology, and I took the first job that I could get out of college because I was so afraid that I wouldn't get a job. And I began noticing that a lot of those habits that I had picked up throughout my college drinking days were carrying in to the real world, adult life. And I started working at a bar as well. So I was working in the service industry in Philadelphia. So, a lot of drinking happening all the time, hanging out with people who were drinking. And I began to notice that I was very unfulfilled, not happy with myself, a little bit lost, as probably everyone who has graduated from university will feel whenever you're just, thrown out into the world, and began using alcohol more as a coping mechanism to deal with those big uncomfortable feelings. And I really, that's when I started experiencing anxiety for the first time after drinking, or hangxiety, as it is now known. And the thing about it was that the way that I was drinking wasn't necessarily different than anyone else that I was hanging out with was drinking. I was going out and partying with people who were going out and partying, so it looked normal on the outside. But I was just really struggling with it. I knew, hangovers were starting to affect me for days on end, and blackouts were becoming more common. Texting people, we've all been there, saying things you don't mean, and just really having the negative mental health effects of recovering from drinking. And then it became obsessing over my drinking, trying to moderate, trying to take a break. And then I decided, after working for a year, once I finished college, I was like, right, that's it. I'm going to move to Limerick. I'm going to do my master's because I'm a dual citizen. It's way cheaper to do it here than in the US, for one thing. But it was the old geographical cure. This is going to fix my drinking. And while there were certain things about my drinking that did change whenever I moved over here, I was still drinking more than I wanted to. It was still very hard to stop drinking once I had started. I knew that I was still using it in an unhealthy way at the end of the week to kind of escape the stress and just pressures of being a student, day-to-day life, relationships, all of that, and began experimenting with taking a break. That's really what I wanted to do. But I really struggled for a long time because I feel like for so long, and thankfully it's changing now, there was a narrative where if you drink, you're one of two things. You're either a normal drinker or you're an alcoholic, but there's a gray area in between where the majority of us who drink fall. And anyone who drinks has a relationship with alcohol, and it changes throughout, over the course of whatever time that you're drinking. And so basically, started trying to take a break, and I was getting 1 to 2 weeks. I really wanted to take a month off to kind of reset myself. But I was really struggling to do that. And anyone who's made a promise to themselves and broken it over and over and over again knows how much that tears down your self confidence and your trust in yourself and your self esteem. And then I was worried about, oh my God, is this really a problem if I can't take longer than a month off? But I don't think I'm an alcoholic, but I know that drinking affects me really badly. So eventually, the long and short of it was I was up in Belfast. I got to go up to Belfast to do my PhD. Very stressful for anyone who's done that. So definitely, again, leaning on alcohol as a coping mechanism. And then the pandemic happened, and I said, right, I'm not going to drink. And then it was 6 Friday nights in a row that I had drank when I said I wasn't going to. Got up the Saturday, okay, I'm not drinking next weekend. And that happened 6 weeks in a row. And I just really had to look at myself and say, this is a problem now. You really need to throw yourself into this. And I had always struggled because I believe that alcohol helped me fit in for so long. So I was worried that when I took alcohol out of the equation, I would feel left out. I would feel like I didn't belong. Friendships would change, all of these things. And um, thankfully, in May of 2020, I was able to take that 30-day break, which I was really proud of myself for. And I realized through doing that that there were other ways that I could have fun. There were other ways that I could relax that didn't involve hangovers and anxiety for days on end afterwards. And so I just kept going, and through that decided to start a community of people called Sober Social Ireland, where we just get together, have a coffee, go on a hike, and just meet people who have had a similar experience as me, which has been so important. And sharing my story, just like what Timmy was saying, so important because there's such a shame wrapped up in drinking. It's a very private, it's a very personal thing. And every time that you share your story, a part of that shame lifts because shame can't exist in silence. So every time I was talking about it, it lifted and lifted more and more.
Wow, that's amazing. Sober social is something that may be something that you're familiar with out there, guys, but we are going to dig a little bit deeper into that in a couple of minutes. Oisín, I'll just move on to you. We've heard some really interesting stories of what was born out of the pandemic between the Two Norries, your own, obviously, sober social, Melissa, which has totally transformed yours and the lives of others around you. Before we get to the pandemic and the prevalence of gambling and gambling addiction, when lots of other facets of life changed during that 2 year period, Oisín, I know you hate the term celebrity and you balk at the term, but you would have had that celebrity status at a very young age as one of the top footballers in the country. Success came very young to you, winning an All Ireland in 2002 and everything that followed. Was it a coping mechanism to deal with that that led to the start of your own gambling addiction? Or was it something that was always there? Did they coexist? What was your background in that regard?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me down here today. Actually, my mum is she's 88. She's about to turn 89, but called in on the way down the road. Called in yesterday, sorry, before I headed down the road, and she said to me, "Make sure you speak clearly to those people down there, nice and slowly, because otherwise they won't understand you." And I said, "Well, they're doing subtitles, but it turns out they're not. So I hope everybody can understand me when I'm talking." But my gambling actually started at 14 years of age. Again, it was curiosity. I started gambling on the Grand National, 14 years of age. I think at 50p each way on a horse. Wasn't going to break the bank immediately, but I just loved everything about it. Loved the trappings, loved the deflection. Uh, One of my issues when I was growing up, one of my many issues was that at 11 years of age, I did a thing called the transfer test for the 11 plus. So it meant what school you ended up in. So I ended up failing the 11 plus, but still going to a grammar school because I could play football. But I had many insecurities around that. and the insecurities came from the fact that academically it just wasn't that good. And I knew I was going to struggle in that school, and that's exactly the way it turned out. At probably 12 years of age, I started looking for something outside of school and outside of sport. And I found gambling at 14 years of age. By 18, I was in addiction. I was gambling every single day with every single penny I had. I started to beg, borrow, steal in order to feed that addiction. Um, at 17 years of age, I was still at school and I'd made my debut with Armagh. I'd come on in a McKenna Cup final. Not quite the top of the game, but I was making my way. I come on and I scored a goal in 4 points, and I went into school the next day, and on the notice board it had the back of the Irish News, and the back of the Irish News it said "Schoolboy Downs down." And see, when I seen that, I said, "You know what? This football thing is great because that's going to deflect from everything else that's going on in the background." Because even at 17, 18 years of age, I was ashamed and embarrassed of what was going on, but I couldn't arrest what I was doing for one day because that was where I was getting my fulfillment from. That was where when I went in and I gambled, similar to what Melissa said about it, just took me to a different place. Nothing else mattered. Nobody else mattered, and it gave me a focus. And also, while giving me a focus, I enjoyed it. Initially, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed all the trappings. All of my heroes growing up were sports people, understandably. But when I went into the bookies, I picked out two or three people who I always thought were winners, and I started to try and follow them. And I suppose I set out on a crusade to do that at 14 years of age, and by the time I was 25, I my life was a mess. There was carnage everywhere. I had bounced from one thing to the other. So what I like to do is I like to blame the things around me. So I bounced from one school to the next school. I left school at 18 years of age, got a job, and I bounced from one job to the next job to the next job. Usually lasted about 12 months. One relationship to the next relationship to the next relationship. Um, one friendship group to the next friendship group. Because incident, I find it incredible to think this now, but I had drifted through all of those periods thinking, actually, you know what? The things around me are the issues. I never thought there was one common denominator. And when I realized that at 25, I knew I needed help. I had a fair idea where to go and get that help, but I still couldn't go. And that was because of the shame and embarrassment that I felt and the bravado. When I walked into the change rooms in Armagh, I didn't just say hello to people, I went around and give everybody a high five. That's because I wanted everybody to think everything in my life was great. I did not want people to think that I was struggling. In 1989, this is how far I go back playing football. I was the one running about with my collar up and my jersey. If I had to get my hands on a pair of pink boots at that stage, I would have wore them. But the reason for that was to deflect away from what was actually going on in my life. I was a big, I was big into perception. So if I thought people perceived something, I thought they believed it, and that wasn't actually the case. But it was another 4 years of complete carnage, beg, borrow, steal, hook, scam, scheme, destroying relationships, breakdown in family relationships before I actually held my hand up and I said, "Do you know what? I'm going to say I held my hand up. I held my hand up because I didn't see, I didn't get an epiphany. I didn't see a light or anything like that. I held my hands up because I could not handle the pressure anymore. I could not handle the people I owed money to, the relationship breakdown, to having nowhere to go, nobody to talk to. I couldn't handle any of that anymore. And that's why I reached out and asked for help. As far as the football was concerned, football was an issue. The reason why football was an issue was because people give me a bye ball all the time. Don't open your mouth to him. There's a big game coming up, and I kept getting uh, kicked down the curb as far as somebody actually addressing with me and seeing what was exactly was going on. Because my gambling was fairly hidden, even though I was somebody who walked into the bookmaker. But the thing about football was that It sounds dramatic, but at that time, football was the only thing that kept me alive. And the reason why that was because that was the only place I felt I added value. I had anything to offer people, and without football, I was nothing. So I don't think that today, but that's the way. That was my thinking at the time, and that was what dominated a lot of what went on in my life around that time.
Well, and we might come back to that notion that gambling is almost a hidden addiction, because it doesn't always have the same physical manifestations that perhaps drug addiction or alcohol addiction does, but it most certainly has the psychological impacts of it. Timmy, there's just something that Eugene said there in terms of that security versus insecurity. And something you've often touched on in both your interviews, your podcast, is that feeling of vulnerability. You know, that now you know it's okay to be not okay. It's okay to be vulnerable. Whereas growing up in what you've described as a socially disadvantaged, lower socioeconomic status environment, it most certainly was not okay to be vulnerable. That you had to be the man, the bravado. Do you think that was part of the starting point that led to your addictions?
Yes, of course. But that was a long road. That was a really long road. Where I grew up in a single parent family. You know, my mother suffered with depression, and there was consistently something going on in the house. There was a lot of violence, and there was a lot of abuse and neglect in the home as well. And like if I was out in the street and somebody was after beating me that was older than me, like you dare and go in home and tell your mom tell say anything because you get worse, you get twice as worse. And that's just how it was. You know, this was the 80s growing up. It was a really difficult time for a lot of families. There was a lot of poverty in the country. There weren't many jobs. And like the difference between that, my upbringing to my child, say for example, if I had a dog back then and the dog died, um, you were told, get on with it, it's only a dog, you know. You weren't allowed to get emotional, get on with it, you know. But like we recently had a dog that died, and I was able to console my child, allow him to cry. You know, these are the changes in me. I'm not saying that's how I was all the time, but I would have growing up in this way and I had to learn how to allow my child to grieve. You know, but my own kind of development of allowing myself to be vulnerable was a tough process because of my upbringing. So, in order for me to really heal from a lot of the trauma and a lot of the different things that was going on for me, I had a lot of core beliefs about myself that were really bad. I felt like I was no good, I was worthless. You know, you'll never amount to anything. You're thick, you're stupid, you know, because of being in school and not being able to listen because of the ADHD and the dyslexia and all these different things. So I had to really kind of look at what was stopping me from allowing myself to feel and allow stuff going on for me. And it was that fight, that it was that innate kind of mentality and structure that I built up as a young child to fight everything. You know, you have to fight back. Don't allow anybody to take advantage of you. Don't allow, and that was also myself. So I fought every emotion that came into me, into my body. This is early recovery, because when I was in active addiction, there was no emotions. There was happy. There was sad. Happy when you're stoned or drunk or gambling or whatever it may be, and sad and depressed then when I wasn't. You know, so I had to really, really learn about emotions as well. And I done that through the process of meeting with a therapist once a week for years, psychologist in prison for about 3 years, and then after that, a psychotherapist in the outside for another 3, 4 years. Also working on myself as well, doing meditation, doing personal development stuff, and all these different things, and just allowing myself to sit with me, sit with every piece of fucking every emotion and every thought that was going on inside of my head, all the shit that was there, all these core beliefs that were built into me since I was a young child. You know, I had to understand where they came from, how they were developed. I had to understand because I always believed I was just a bad person. always believed that I was no good, I was a bad person. And that changed in me when I started to change, and I started, and it was always always wanted to make sure when I was ever doing a podcast that I wanted to show people that there's nobody actually born bad. It's the environment that we're brought up in and how people influence us, and maybe within the school, out in the street, the home might be a very violent home, and somebody has to come completely cut off emotionally as a young child in order for them to cope in that environment. You know,
Protect themselves.
it's a mechanism for you have to be able to, and that's what happened to me. I can remember that exact moment as a young child that happening to me, because I would have been beaten a lot and being. I remember hiding underneath a bed and just you know the schools back then were very religious. There was Catholic or pray, if you pray to God, it won't happen, or all this kind. So I remember being a young child consistently praying for these things to stop and stop and stop, and not never changed. And I remember something happening, and this day anyway, and just going completely into myself, and completely after that, I just felt emotionless. I felt numb, and I lived in my head. That's when I started to really live in my head because I cut
How
off.
old were you at that stage,
I
Timmy?
was about 6 or 7.
6 or 7. Wow.
Shit was going on. There was suicidal thoughts and ideation as a young child as well. So I was completely cut off from humanity. I felt like I was a robot going around the place. I didn't feel connected to anybody. I had no attachment to any of my parents or anything like that. School was different. There was bullying in the streets. So when I was able to understand that myself, and then I could have compassion and empathy for other people who were behaving in the ways that I was behaving because I understood where they were coming from. And then my goal then was trying to get other people who didn't have a really difficult upbringing, who grew up in a loving and caring environment where there was food, there was shelter, their parents were there, the teachers were there for them. To get them to understand that, like, not everybody grew up the same way you did in the loving environment. Some people have it really, really tough. And later on in life, they behave in ways that you don't actually understand and you classify them as a bad person. But the matter of fact, they're not just bad people. They just had a really difficult upbringing and they're behaving in the ways they do because they think everybody is the same way as the people who brought them up and hurt them. Does that make sense?
No, it absolutely does. And in contrast, Melissa, is it fair to say that you would have had a very different upbringing insofar as that, and without knowing too much, but you've traveled between the States and Ireland, you completed high school, you did a bachelor's degree, you went on and did a PhD, you're in postdoctoral research now, but you still fell victim to addiction. So we had the environmental impact, which is so significant that Timmy has outlined there. In terms of your own background with a relatively solid environment, I presume, what was the trigger for you in that regard?
Yeah, I guess that really goes to demonstrate that alcohol does not discriminate. No matter where you're from, how you're brought up, how many healthy relationships you have, it's still a chemically addictive drug at the end of the day. And I had, a great upbringing. Yes, there were certain life transitions moving back and forth that really affected me. But going back to what Timmy said, like, it really does have to do with your relationship with yourself. And when you're drinking in an unhealthy way, you're usually using it to cope with the negative self talk, core beliefs that you have, that I definitely had um, growing up, specifically around belonging, not being good enough. Part of the reason I probably chased the master's degree and the PhD was to kind of prove to other people what I didn't believe about myself, which was that I was smart enough, good enough, talented enough, worked hard enough, and I'm still going through those beliefs to this day. And it really is such a journey, but it really doesn't matter how you were brought up in many ways because alcohol will affect you because of the way that it's designed. It does numb the negative and it enhances the positive. And yeah, it can happen to anybody, really. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. Oisín, gambling, is it different? Because I suppose there is that dopamine hit when you win, but then equally the next race could be 4 minutes later in Doncaster or Punchestown or the Curragh, and then you might be brought down immediately, and then you go chase the next victory. From your experience, and what some of you may not know is Oisín is also a qualified addiction counselor. From your experience of working with people who suffer from addiction, can you see a delineation between drug and alcohol dependence and addiction and gambling? I'm just curious about where that difference lies, if at all.
I'm convinced that it could have been alcohol for me, or it could have been drugs. It, I my gambling was a response to an emotional problem I had, and that was how I cope with that emotional problem. But as I say, it could have been any addiction, but it almost feels now. I I don't I don't know whether I was predisposed to it or anything else. That's a debate for another day. But I felt as if whenever I started to gamble, that I was going to become a compulsive gambler. I felt as if gambling was going to play a huge part in my life because it filled a void for me at that time. Um, but there's so many similarities. I mean, apart from what you're actively doing. So what I was actively doing, I was gambling. As I say, it could have been alcohol, could have been something else. But the thing about um, my gambling was, I thought my gambling when I went into addiction, when I went into treatment, and somebody told me I was in addiction, it never really registered with me because I hadn't a clue what addiction was. As far as I was concerned, addiction was the guy who was laying on the park bench with a bottle of wine and a brown bag on it. I didn't know you could be addicted and still function the way I was trying to function right up until the end. And the thing about going into treatment was that I started to learn about addiction, and I started to learn about why I was the way I was, because I felt a lot of times I didn't fit in certain places. Now I would force myself to fit in, but I felt genuinely uncomfortable in so many situations, so many social situations, um, and the more I withdrew, the happier I was. The more I went into my addiction initially, the happier I was. And then all of a sudden, my addiction was a barrier to me doing anything, functioning in any sort of way. I mean, for me to leave the room, I would have to psych myself up to leave the room to get through the next couple of hours. I I liken it to somebody going on stage. So somebody going on stage, they get into character for an hour or 2 hours or whatever it is. When I left the house, I felt I get into character. When I was in character, I was bulletproof. Back into the house, and I just come straight down to the floor again. When I gambled, I was either on the floor or up in the sky. There was nothing in between. It was either the massive lows or the big highs. And I think the similarities between alcohol addiction, drug addiction, and gambling addiction, they are all very, very similar. And I suppose the thing about my gambling addiction, when people ask me about my gambling addiction, they want to talk about how much money you lost, how much money did you win, what was your biggest win, because a lot of people see it as like a financial issue. But as I say, mine was because of a response to an emotional problem. Yeah, you end up in huge amounts of debt, and that's part of the reality of being in a gambling addiction. But the things I got back after I stopped gambling were my emotions, my feelings, self-respect, self-esteem, integrity, the relationships. I was able to build the relationships back up. I was able to look people in the eye. I was able to do the things that I had not been able to do for 16 years. And I know I've gone off topic now, but yeah, there's loads of similarities between all of the addictions, because it's not about what people are actively doing. What you see somebody stumbling out of a pub, see somebody walking out of a bookies in despair. It's what has led the person in order to get there in the first place. I had lots of opportunities when I was growing up where I could have said, listen, I actually don't feel 100%. I wouldn't mind a bit of a dig out, but to ask for help seemed at that stage in my life seemed like even worse than ending up where I ended up.
Okay. Wow. So we've got an insight into almost what led the start of the addiction journey, the impact of it in some cases. What I'm particularly interested in now, Timmy, is that light bulb moment where something had to change. Oisín has already said he didn't particularly want to, but he felt he had to because of circumstances. You've already talked about the importance of talk therapy, of working with a therapist. Was it a light bulb moment? Was it a sequence of events? What led you into, the journey that you're on today as an advocate?
Yeah, it was a light. It was definitely a light bulb. It was just a bit of clarity, really. It was like a spiritual experience, something that I'd never experienced before. Just remember after being arrested again for another violent crime, and I had drugs on me as well at the time when I was arrested. I'd tried to resist arrest as well with two guards. I was after assaulting two guards, and I ended up inside in a cell in the Bible, Cork, um, and even though I was physically harmed, because of resisting arrest and being manhandled by guards and stuff. Um, there was a doctor with me, and there was a solicitor, and the only thing like the only thing that was on my mind was, will they just fuck off out and just leave me here because I had drugs planked on me on my body, and the only thing that I wanted, this was St. Stephen's Day in 2012, 11. My children were home. I hadn't seen my kids for Christmas because there was a bar order against me in the house, um, because of the violence and the drugs and the guards coming around the door. I was completely out of control. I was chaotic. I was happy. Like if my life had ended at that moment, I was quite comfortable with it happening. I was actually hoping that it would have, you know. So I remember being in the cell anyway, waiting for them to leave. And when they had all left, I was in the cell. I was naked. All I had was a blanket, and the drugs. There was no drugs there, so I ended up having to crawl on my knees around the floor, which was grey, and there was little white splotches of paint on the floor, and I thought there were cracks of cocaine. And something just happened to me. It was just like it was the first bit of awareness I'd ever experienced. It was like the words were like, "What are you doing with your life? Like your children are home; they haven't seen you for Christmas. You have a newborn baby. You know, all you seem to be doing is hurting people." And there was no consideration for the harm I was doing for myself. And that was it. I got up off the floor, I got up in the concrete slab, and I cried. Big man, no, full of tattoos, full of muscles, and all this shit. I thought I was, selling drugs. I thought I was the boy, you know, um, heavily addicted to cocaine and crack and everything else. And I cried until I fell asleep. The next day, I got out after being interviewed, and I went to my partner at the time, whose home I wasn't left into, but I had nowhere else to go. And she left me into the house, and I slept in the couch. The next day, I got up on my own accord. I went to my doctor, and he put me on medication. And he got me to see a counsellor immediately, and I went into pre-treatment. And I went into treatment in February. Um, and from treatment, then I went straight to prison for 5 years, and I kept on. That's where I learned to read and write. That's where I kept up my education. I went to AA in prison. That's where I got to know my kids. Even though it was a visit once a week, because I had no communication, no relationship with them or my partner, and that's where my life started to develop. But also at this time, like recovery wasn't an easy process for me either because I was now becoming conscious and aware, and all the shit that I blocked out for so many years with the use of drink and drugs and gambling and food and sex addiction, all these things were starting to resurface. So I had to deal with all the abuse from childhood, all the fucking shame and fear and guilt of all the different things that I'd done to people while I was in addiction. You know, all this stuff started to surface, and it was a really, really challenging time in my life. I don't think for a while there wasn't a day that didn't go by that like I would have contemplated taking my own life because I didn't know how to deal with the emotional aspect of what was going on in my body and the thoughts then because my belief systems were very, very bad about myself. So I crippled myself. I completely gave myself a hard time. I was always looking for recognition from other people about myself, whether I was doing something good or bad or whatever. I was like a child. I remember walking the prison yard with my brothers or with other guys that were in prison with me, and I couldn't even have a conversation because I felt like I was a child. It was like I was just after waking up, and I was a 7 or 8 year old child, and I had no vocabulary. You know, I was just completely numb to the conversations, the relationships, the emotions, and I hadn't a clue. And that's when my journey started. It was about 13 years ago, and it has been a step by step process. And I always explain it. It's like a stairs. You know, every step along the way has been very important in my life, and has helped me to move on to the next stage of my life. Because if I skipped any of it, I wouldn't be ready for the next plate, the next thing, and I just had to learn to sit with it because people who are in recovery want to do everything now because they wasted so much time in addiction. They want to fucking get the education, they want to go on the holidays, they want to make money. And I done that at the start and I nearly drove myself mad. I nearly ended up back in medication for depression and stuff. And I had to learn to really control myself. That was the moment, but that's what stemmed from that moment. That was 13 years ago now, December gone, and my life is completely transformed. You know, drugs and alcohol. Like I have younger brothers as well who've been in and out of prison all their lives, living on the streets, and they have followed me into recovery as well. One now is 6 years, 6.5 years in recovery, and he was on the streets when he got sober and clean. And the other fellow was living in a tent when he got sober as well. Because when we were all in prison, I was on the same landing as three brothers, so there was four of us in prison at the one time. Our mother had committed suicide, um, and our family home that we had for 35 years was taken from us. So we were all homeless coming out of prison then as well. On top of that, so we had to kind of rebuild. And now at the moment we're actually rebuilding our own family because we're all sober. We're talking about shit, stuff that we'd never known how to talk about before. Now we're talking about it. Years ago, we dealt with conflict through violence. We slaughtered each other. But now we're able to sit, try to keep the tone of our voice down a little bit as well, and we're showing our own children as well, like how to how to behave. That this way is not right, and we can behave in this way. We don't always get it right, but my life has completely transformed since I put down drink, drugs, gambling, anything that took me away from how I was feeling within myself. You know, now I've learned to sit with myself. You know, sometimes I'm not able to do it, and I might go for a walk. You know, I might go to the gym or a run or whatever it may be, because it can be uncomfortable at times to sit with yourself. But I had to learn to do it. You know.
Wow, there's one thing about being proud of the impact you can have on nameless faces, people all over the country that you may never see or meet or converse with. But the fact that it started in your own house with your own family and your own younger brothers, you must take huge pride out of that. So, full applause. Melissa, um, it's joked about and it's talked seriously about that as a nation, the Irish have a complicated relationship with drink, maybe dependence. We know from the data that over 60% of Irish people over 15 years of age drink regularly and at least drink or have drank in the last 6 months. Having come from the States and perhaps having started your difficulties at the end of high school over there, and with your expertise, do you see it as a cultural challenge that we are constantly facing as a nationality, as a cultural group?
Um, I mean, yeah, definitely. I mean, here in Ireland, and in the US. Like there are so many similarities at the end of the day. Alcohol is so wrapped up in sports culture, in pub culture, music, everything like that. And in a way, the Irish have been through so much over the years that it's any wonder that people picked, drinking up as largely a coping mechanism and a way of kind of holding on to a bit of that culture as well. Um, and I feel like it's something, even whenever I was over in America and I started drinking, my American friends would say, "Oh, Melissa, you're the Irish one, you can drink." And there is that stereotype of, the Irish, whether it's they're in Canada or Australia or in the US, they tend to stick together. Like my parents both live in the US now. They're both Irish, and they don't have any American friends after 30 or 40 years. Like the Irish just stick together in the pubs, and it really is part of that culture. I do think it is changing slowly but surely. I know that as alcohol becomes more expensive, and as there's more restrictions around advertising alcohol, there's more celebrities coming out now, and even just podcasts and people talking about struggling with their drinking and drug addiction. As more and more of that has come to light, I'm not sure how much the instance of drug abuse maybe makes up for where the drinking is slowing down. But it's amazing to see even, the 0-0 offerings. And I have to say, from going back and forth between the US and Ireland, Ireland has far more 0-0 options more readily available. And that was a big part of my own journey. I really enjoyed having a drink that looked like alcohol, that stopped people from asking me, "Oh, why are you not drinking?" I know there's people who disagree and think that, maybe it shouldn't be a part of recovery, and everyone has their own, journey and perspective on that. There's people who would never drink an alcohol-free drink who are in recovery, and there's people who rely on it to quit drinking. And I didn't rely on it, but it was definitely a big part of my journey into recovery. And I think that with those alcohol-free options, you can kind of keep some of those cultural aspects. Like I do love going into a nice pub where there's a fire lit and there's people, there's music playing and people are having fun. Um, and yeah, there's definitely differences, but things are look to be changing slowly but surely.
Would it surprise you if I shared with you a statistic from a recent research report? The Healthy MTU team here in MTU, Andrew, myself, and colleagues, and the UCC medical team conducted research with over 1,200 students and nearly 900 staff in the last 12 months, and 77.8% of students admitted to binge drinking on a regular occasion. But what surprised a lot of people was that 62.4% of staff also admitted to binge drinking regularly. Does that surprise you? Maybe the students, or maybe more so the staff data?
No, not really. I mean, alcohol, it's something that's very Moorish. Once you have one, it's very hard to stop. And people don't realize that binge drinking is five or more drinks, basically, five standard units. So, how many of us would drink that on a night out and not even, consider that to be binge drinking? But no, it doesn't surprise me. I think that it's such a socially acceptable thing. It's how a lot of people socialize. It's how a lot of people have fun. I think, especially, I don't know if you have statistics before and after the pandemic, but the pandemic definitely ramped up people's drinking. And here in Ireland, back in, I don't know, 50, 100 years ago, home drinking wasn't really a thing. People definitely were going out to pubs to drink, and nowadays people are more so, it's almost romanticized to like sit down with your Netflix and your glass of wine or your pint and play your video game or whatever it is, like, and drink to relax by yourself. And that's really where I started noticing I had some of an issue where it wasn't so much going out with people, it was the home drinking as well. And that's something that can be kept very secretive, and hidden. And I think that, that is probably where people are not even realizing that they're binge drinking, having, a couple of beers to wind down on a Friday or anything like that.
Okay. Okay. What was worrying when we unpacked that data was over 25% of students were classified at increased risk in terms of their alcohol consumption behavior using the audit C scale. So when we did dig a bit deeper, we're not going to go into the data today,
Yeah.
but when we did dig deeper, over 25% of students were at an increased risk of the impact of their drinking, which is quite worrying, for an 18 to 22-year-old cohort. Oisín, Timmy has talked about the importance of talk therapy, of psychological intervention, of psychotherapy. We're very lucky in MTU. We have an amazing honors degree program in psychotherapy. We have nursing and addiction studies in the Kerry campus. And then across the university, we have an amazing student counselling service. Just to bring this full circle, because I'm conscious of time, how important is it to take that first step in your professional role as an addiction counsellor, just to reach out to speak as the starting point to try and get on the road to recovery for anyone in the room who may be in that position who has yet to take that first step?
Once you share it with another individual, the journey that you're on, whether that be a professional, whether that be a family member, doctor, doesn't really matter. Coach, teacher, counselor within the college or whatever else. Once you share that with one person, your addiction will never ever be the same again. And for a lot of people, that is the catalyst in order to further recovery. And for a lot of people, it may not work first time around. In fact, there may be a lot of challenges and humps and bumps along the way. But once you initially share that with somebody, that journey is never the same again. Um, Somebody once told me that they shared it with somebody and um, they continued to drink, they continued in their addiction, but the addiction was never the same again. And they felt as if there was an inevitability about the, for the reach out for help and long term recovery. But you will not get long term recovery unless you're working some sort of program. And a lot of that revolves around what Timmy said around talking therapy. I often talk about um, when I went into rehab, when I went into a treatment center, it's almost like a pre-season. I'm not saying somebody can't play football or hurling and get through a season without picking up any injury, but they have a lot better chance if they've gone into if they've the preseason done, they have a little bit of work behind them. So treatment is not for everybody, and there's so many routes in order to. There's things that are recommended and prescribed, but a lot of people find their own way through recovery, and I think that's what I found is that it's not a one size fits all. But certainly that initial thing of reaching out, unless you do that, you will not end up. Or luckily enough, us three have ended up.
And that is the story, really, isn't it? The reason that our three friends and colleagues are here today is because they have come out the other side. And of course, we cannot forget about all the others who are still struggling through their trials, their tribulations, their addictions. But the proof is here that with the right support, the right attitude, a lot of years, a lot of patience, Timmy, like you said, that it is possible. So I'd just like to invite Andrea back to the stage just to close proceedings. And just on behalf of myself, colleagues, can I just pay a huge thank you to Timmy, to Melissa, and to Oisín.
Thank you, Cian. Thank you, Timmy, Melissa, and Oisín, for such an impactful discussion. And thank you for being so honest and so real. And I think we've all taken some messages away from that. Just a few quick thank yous to the Healthy MTU team who worked really hard to bring you the event today, to everybody who helped us to set up, and to you all for giving the time today. And hopefully you found it impactful. And just to acknowledge everyone joining us via live stream as well. You'll see here, we're going to leave them displayed. There are some links to wonderful supports here at the university if anyone feels that they'd like to avail of those. So please do consider making contact if anything has resonated with you today. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for coming, and thank you once again to our panel.